In tonight's edition of The Issue, the Turnbull government is promising that its new national energy guarantee will deliver cheaper power. It also says it will lower emissions and meet our Paris commitments. Is it too good to be true? Labor says it's the policy driven by Tony Abbott, but they also say that this is an effective carbon price. So can it be both? Joining me tonight, the Australia Institute's Ben Oquist and the IPA's Evan Mulholland. Welcome to both of you.
Be here.
Good evening, Patricia.
So, Ben, is it a carbon price?
Well, essentially it's going to work like an emissions intensity scheme, and if an emissions intensity scheme is a carbon price, it is. It puts an obligation on retailers to find a certain proportion of their electricity, their energy from low emission sources, and to make it absolutely crystal clear, you're then allowed to meet those obligations by buying certificates both domestically through the ERF or internationally. So that if an EIS is a carbon price, and if buying and trading certificates makes it a carbon price, then it is. But importantly, it's a scheme that doesn't have any ambition, and a scheme without credible ambition based on science and economics can't be a credible scheme. You can't have the architecture right and not have the targets right, because in the end, if you don't, investors won't have the confidence that this scheme is going to be around for a long time and be a meaningful one that they can bank and invest on. And of course, if you can't invest, you're not going to bring in that new supply, and that's that supply that's going to deliver reliability and ultimately lower prices. You have to do all three. You can't put emissions at the bottom of the heap, because if you do, i.e. we've got to meet the Paris targets or not. It's not a question of whether they're a priority or not. We're going to meet them or not, and we're going to meet them in the most economically efficient way or not. And what the government's come up with doesn't do that.
Evan, do you agree, at least on that part? I'm sure you'll disagree on other parts, but that it's a price on carbon, it's an emission intensity scheme? It
does work similarly to an emissions intensity scheme, a clean energy target, and to a RET, in that it forces the move to renewables in favour of renewables to the detriment of coal. Now, with a national energy guarantee, they do have this reliability guarantee, which forces retailers to offset their purchases of renewables with some sort of coal or gas, more reliable forms of energy. I think the government can hold its head high in that it's got a differential now in wanting to remove the $60 billion of subsidies to the renewables energy industry. And we saw in recent news polls where, when given a number of options, almost 50% of people won't pay extra for renewables if it comes at the expense of higher power prices.
Well, you're going to no doubt, Ben, quote the Reachtel poll today, which finds the majority in 3 Liberal-held seats support carbon pricing and more ambitious renewable policy. Is that right?
Yeah, well, the Australia Institute's Climate and Energy Program did put out that research today that shows in Abbott's seat, in Turnbull's seat, in Frydenberg's seat, voters are much more likely to back a plan if it's got higher levels of renewable energy, if renewable energy is at 50% or more, and it's got stronger emissions targets. They also want to ensure that states can have more ambitious renewable energy targets. But it's not just that research that we put out today. I saw that poll in The Australian recently showing that 60% plus or more of the population wanted to keep support going for renewables. Now, the government might still be in a war against renewables, but the electorate has moved on. The electorate wants renewables. They want to back them, and for good reason. They know it's the future. They know renewables are now bringing down prices, and they know with storage, demand management, demand response,
sure,
energy
and this
efficiency,
new policy,
you can meet
this
all
new policy keeps renewables in the system.
Problems.
This new policy allows renewables. The new policy allows for renewables to stay in the system.
Well, the problem with the new policy is the ambition. Let's go back to Finkel. Finkel found that if you did nothing, business as usual would see 35% renewable energy penetration by 2030. The government has come out and said with their new scheme, renewable energy penetration might be 28% by 2030, so less than business as usual. I mean, you're going to have to start ripping solar panels off people's roofs to get down to 28% renewables by 2030. They're marching ahead, and I guess I go back to that central problem, the credibility of the ambition. If the government is to meet its Paris targets, emissions from the electricity sector are going to have to be much higher than a 26% reduction. All the previous modelling has shown that you're going to have emission reduction from electricity between 40 to 55%, because if you don't, other sectors of the economy are going to have to do much more. That means sectors like agriculture are going to have to drive their emissions down much harder at a much higher cost. All the modelling has shown in the past if we meet the Paris targets.
Yeah, Ben, the problem with renewables and the rush to renewables is being done in an uneconomic and uncommercial way, pushing renewables into the energy market without any need for to provide storage or baseload power. The renewable energy target is a perfect example of an inane policy that has been pushed forward. Over 15 years of the renewable energy target, it makes just 0.0004% difference to Australia's greenhouse emissions every year. And we see the intervention upon intervention in the market of renewables and the effect that it's had on the industry. South Australia is the biggest public relations disaster the renewables industry has ever seen. It's got the highest power prices in the world.
If I can ask you a specific question, Evan, you've assessed this policy. You know, we've had about 5 days to look it over, and we all have been doing it. Journalists, policy analysts, all of us. What's your conclusion? Is Tony Abbott right that it's still not good enough? Peter Credlin's also written a column today very critical of it. What's your assessment?
Well, my problem is it still contains the emissions reduction component of it. Australia will meet it only contributes 1.5% to global greenhouse emissions. There is a lot to like about it. And there's an old saying in politics, if no one's happy, you're probably about right. And Turnbull and Josh Frydenberg did look good, surrounded by a number of experts. Politically, it looks good if you heard what's coming out of the party room. Tony Abbott was shouted down, and applause was given to Turnbull and Frydenberg for this policy. So politically, it does look like a good policy. It has Labor on the back foot. Bill Shorten's on the one hand saying, oh, you know, it's only going to be 50% reduction in prices by 2020, but at the other hand trying to poke the backbench and saying it's a carbon price. So he looks like he's on the back foot, and politically it could be a good move for Turnbull here.
I think you mean 50 cents a week, not 50% reduction, because that'd be very impressive. I don't know if anyone can pull that off. Ben, I'll give you the final word. Labor is kind of, you know, really sitting on the fence, and depends what day you get them on, but basically saying they want to see more modelling, they won't commit yet. I know the Greens are putting pressure on them not to support it, but doesn't this provide architecture that they could clearly, you know, increase all of the demands they want to make on reducing emissions later on, but it provides architecture at least to settle on?
Look, there's no doubt a national energy guarantee, which is effectively an emissions intensity scheme. It differs from a set or a RET. They only provide incentives for new build power, but this provides incentives to existing power. And there's no question it couldn't work if it was designed right. But for the Labor Party federally, they're not really being asked to support it or not. This is a negotiation that's going to have to happen with the states. We're not proposing any federal legislation soon. What the government has embarked upon is a negotiation with the states, and I think that's where it runs into political trouble. We've got the state elections coming up in Queensland, in South Australia, and then in Victoria, and the states want more ambitious renewable energy. And the problem with what the government's coming up with is it says we're going to put new obligations on renewable energy that's going to make it harder for you to meet your renewable energy targets. Victoria's just legislated one in the last week for a higher target. And there's no sign that Premier Weatherill wants to move away from renewables, but because why should he? As Dick Warburton found in the past, the renewable energy target has actually lowered wholesale electricity prices by bringing in more competition, and removing the renewable energy target, which the government's not going to do. They're not going to change the legislation. Would actually increase prices. So I think the big political problem for the government is it's setting up a long-term fight with the states, not proposing to deal with Labor at a federal level. But I go back to that central point. You can't have a credible plan without a credible target, and the targets in this plan are not credible.
All right, Ben and Evan, I have to wrap it up, but I don't think this energy war's going anywhere, quite frankly. I don't know. I'm calling it. It's not going anywhere. Thanks so much for your time.
Indeed.
Thank you.